Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to be talking about the climate crisis, which is still, in all probability, the number one challenge confronting all 8.2 billion people on the planet. My guest today is an expert on this topic, Dr. John Barkdull, an emeritus professor at Texas Tech University, established and directed the Global Studies program. He taught 2 years as a distinguished visiting professor at the United States Air Force Academy, and he was a Fulbright scholar in Bangladesh and Southeast Asia. His most recent book is Confronting Climate Change. Dr. Barkdull, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Very happy to be here.
I appreciate you being with me. We're going to jump into it. Well, let's just do it right now. Why did you decide to write this book on climate change?
Well, I was a little bit dissatisfied with the status of the dialogue around adaptation on climate change. And so there was a couple of big questions I wanted to explore, which is basically the first half and the second half of the book. First of all, how did this notion of adaptation to climate change develop in the international dialogue? And so I examined documents going back to the beginning of the discussion of global warming back into the 60s and early 70s and up to date, and found some surprises along the way as to how people were addressing that question. And then the second one was as of about the early part of this century, a lot of folks were talking about the need for transformation. And it seemed to me that there was a lot of ambiguity in what they meant by transformation. To some, it was really pretty small changes in our practices, and to others, it was quite sweeping. And so I wanted to sort of investigate and interrogate that concept and identify the alternative notions of transformation, which gives you a kind of a menu of choice before us as we deal with this challenge of climate change.
Exactly. And as we're going to jump right into adaptation in a minute, but when I think back on this, a key player, there have been a lot of players in talking about the climate crisis, and the United Nations has probably been in the forefront of more than any other organization that I can think of anyway, especially with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or even going back to 1992 with the UN Conference on Environment and Development in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Just on across the board, UN agencies, the UN Environment Program, the Sustainable Development Goals have various goals dealing with climate and clean energy issues. But the UN's really been in the forefront on this, has it not?
Yeah, it has. And much of my research was about what was taking place in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change talks, as well as the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and then other international organizations that were attending to what was happening in the UN negotiations. That was a big part of what I was examining to sort of get a sense of the status of adaptation in climate change. So, and what I noticed, especially with 1992 and the Rio conference, was there was a big change in the orientation. That was the point at which governments really took the lead on climate policy, whereas before it had been largely in the hands of scientists. And the scientists were kind of taking for granted that there would be a significant amount of adaptation, that the temperatures would continue to rise, and we would have to figure out ways to live in a world that was considerably warmer than the one before. Whereas when the state actors took over, that's when the dialogue really shifted over to mitigation, that is, reducing the amount of greenhouse gases and otherwise keeping the world cooler so that we wouldn't have to deal with hot temperatures. So that was something that I hadn't expected going in, and saw that there was a pretty big change. The scientists, as I say, were pretty much taking it for granted that we'd have to engage in a lot of adaptation. So once the international organizations like the UN got involved, that really shifted the framework.
It certainly did. And when I hear the term adaptation, I'm not an expert in this, but
Right.
when I hear it, I think of, well, we have to adapt to the changing climate or the climate crisis, or as the Secretary General Antonio Guterres at the United Nations says, it's now climate boiling. It's not just climate change, it's climate boiling. And we can see that from looking at the records. every year is hotter than the year before, than the year before. But is that correct? Is this adaptation is, instead of dealing with the problem, eliminating it or trying to bring it under control, we're just going to adapt to these rising temperatures and figure out a way to keep people alive and not die, have so many die during heat waves and things like that? Is that what adaptation is about?
That's a really good question, because there was a period of time where the whole idea of adaptation sort of was discredited a bit. And that was because there was a fear that if we could adapt to whatever temperatures we experienced, then there would be no need to deal with rising emissions of fossil fuels and the like. So there was a stretch where folks didn't really want to talk about adaptation very much. But then efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions did not succeed very well. It slowed the rate of growth a little bit, but we still are, to this very day, increasing the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. And so at that point, there was no escaping that adaptation would have to occur. The impacts were becoming obvious. I mean, we were, as you know from just reading the newspaper, the West is under a heat dome now that seems to have lasted all summer long, 100 to 110-degree temperatures in Phoenix and Los Angeles and even up to Portland. And that's not unusual. Now, this is the hottest year on record. We have now 14 straight months of record-breaking temperatures. And so at that point, adaptation becomes unavoidable. So then the dialogue shifted to say, well, what we need is a combination of mitigation as much as we can. Every tenth matters, every tenth of a degree matters, along with adaptation to deal with what we have already kind of baked into the system. Because once you've emitted the greenhouse gases, it keeps the temperature up for a long time to come. So that was kind of the approach that then became, and I think probably still is prevalent, which is mitigation plus adaptation. The question is whether we're ever going to get the mitigation, and it doesn't good.
You got it. That's true. That I remember years ago. Well, first off, the fossil fuel companies who knew back in the 50s, they had their scientists doing studies that showed the climate change was actually a phenomenon. It was going to get worse, yet they kept denying it. And then later they said, well, yeah, it's happening, but it's not as fast as we think. So we'll adapt to it. But really, we've reached that point. I mean, we've got to adapt to some degree, obviously, I guess. But unless you deal with it and try to get rid of fossil fuels, try to curtail the carbon footprint, try to get clean energy, get away from gasoline engines or diesel engines or whatever, it really is going to get worse and worse and worse, is it not? There's just, you can adapt a little bit, but you can't adapt your way out of a crisis like this. I don't think, can you?
Well, that was the whole question that really kind of motivated me, because when I started researching, there were studies out there that said that by the end of this century, on the path we were on, we were looking at probably 4 degrees centigrade higher temperatures. And I asked a well-known climate scientist about that, and I said, well, what would the world be like? And I was told, well, it would be a global Syria, because at that time, Syria was, of course, in the middle of a civil war that was in part fueled by drought and hot temperatures that had undermined agriculture and the like, and that this would be what was going on a global scale. And then I examined the data on the direction temperature was going, and it appeared we were staying right on that path. Now, the Paris Agreement and other efforts have in fact abated the amount of growth of greenhouse gas emissions. And so the expectation now is that by the end of the century, we'll be somewhere around 3 degrees temperature increase, maybe a little less. And that's with kind of a moderate emissions scenario, not the extreme one. And so if that is the case, unfortunately, that's still well beyond what the UN has declared as kind of the crisis threshold, which is 2 degrees. And in fact, what the UN at Paris agreed to was to try to hold temperature increases to 1.5 or below, 1.5 centigrade rise or below compared to pre-industrial. We're already there at the 1.5. Now, this year we'll be at that level. That may be a little high, so it may drop back a bit in the coming few years. I think El Nino has something to do with that. But the long-term trend and the level of greenhouse gases we have in the atmosphere right now all suggest that the 1.5 goal is now unattainable, at least with current technologies. So we're probably headed towards that 2.8 to 3 degrees. Okay, so if that's the case, what can adaptation do? And that leads to this kind of the second part of the book, where I look at, faced with a serious problem, are there alternatives that would allow us to make the right choices in terms of policy, practice, the distribution of wealth, social equality, a whole variety of other things that would then enable adequate, effective adaptation to take place. And so that's what.
Those are all points we need to discuss, and we will as soon as we get back from our mid-show ID. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just have a computer, you like our shows and you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to better help us understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're taking a look at probably the #1 challenge to all 8.2 billion people on the planet, and that is the climate crisis. We sometimes call it the climate change, but it's changing so fast. My guest today is an expert on this topic. Dr. John Barkdull is an emeritus professor at Texas Tech University. His most recent book is Confronting Climate Change. Dr. Barkdull, we're talking about, you mentioned several approaches, and we need to move into them to talk about what we can do to adapt, and how is it going to be incremental adaptation, or is it going to be transformational, or what are we going to do? We have to come up with some proposals, and you have some. Just please continue what you were saying a minute ago.
Well, as temperatures rise, and then you have to start looking at what are the barriers to effective adaptation? What stands in the way? And let me point out that at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change itself, as far back as 2014, was, and even before actually, but it was emphasized in their 5th assessment report very strongly, is that sometimes it's the institutional framework that's the barrier, that what they called current development pathways were standing in the way of effective adaptation to climate change. Now, the IPCC tends to draw back from the inference one can make from that, because what are current development pathways? Well, it's largely market-driven, corporate-dominated, international trade in a capitalist system that's governed by a system of sovereign states, along with a variety of international organizations like the IMF and the World Bank and so forth. And development is understood as fostering economic growth, rising per capita incomes, and modernization. So that means mostly going from peasant agriculture and the like to manufacturing and then on up the value chain to service economies and the like. That's what development tends to mean. Now, of course, sustainable development is also part of the UN agenda, and it alters that a bit. But the question is whether that development pathway, governed by those institutions, can make the appropriate choices in the face of a serious climate crisis. As you were mentioning, global boiling. And some people are saying no. So I looked at the literature that was in the climate area of policy, and there was a lot of talk of transformation. And that's where the IPCC, they looked at this shortcoming of institutions and argued that we needed transformational change. But they never actually wanted to spell out what that meant for global capitalism and the like. So one of the things that I did then is I said, well, let's draw on these other bodies of literature that haven't been cited in the IPCC works, and people that have been talking about social change for 2 centuries, and see what they can tell us about what might have to be done to meet the crisis. So that's kind of a preliminary point.
Right. Now, the United Nations, we mentioned a minute ago, has held several conferences on this. In fact, the COP, the Conference of Parties, I think it's 29, I believe, 29 or 30 is meeting in Azerbaijan in November, and they'll come up with some more proposals. But what should they recommend specifically to the countries of the world to help derail this, or at least slow this problem down? I don't think we'll derail it or curtail it or eliminate it for sure. It's too far along. But what recommendations would you make to them specifically that they need to think about doing? And these would be the 193 countries that make up the UN General Assembly. Basically, almost all the countries of the world are represented there.
Well, I can lay out the menu of choice a little bit. I think where the world is really at in those international negotiations is some form of so-called ecological modernization, which says that we can use market incentives and the like to improve our ecological practices. And we don't really need to fundamentally change the nature of our economic system or anything along those lines. Then there's folks that say what we need is the steady state. That is, we need a no-growth economy. Growth is what's getting us, and it's what's causing the climate crisis. And so we need to reform our institutions so that we're in a steady state where we're not having a constant rising flow through of raw materials, especially energy, oil. And others that say we're even beyond that. We need degrowth. That actually has been taken up by the IPCC to some extent, and it's becoming a more prominent alternative, I believe, which is degrowth, which is to say we actually need, in many ways, to shrink our global economic footprint. And then other folks that say, well, that can't happen in a capitalist system because a capitalist system relies on growth. A degrowth capitalist system is a contradiction in terms. So at that point, we have to start looking towards fundamental institutional change, towards, as some people recommend, eco-socialism, or as the Chinese government, at least rhetorically, takes up the idea of an ecological civilization, which then would completely change the institutional framework within which we conduct our day-to-day affairs. So,
we're in a market economy. People say it's a free market, which it's not. We really have, in my opinion anyway, we have monopolistic companies. You've got 3 or 4 companies that dominate the market, and they basically price set, they conspire. We saw what happened during this latest problem with COVID. They raised their prices in some cases just astronomically. It had no bearing on the cost of their doing business. And we've gone, it seems to me, like from capitalism with a face back in the 50s, 60s, 70s to a capitalism that doesn't have a face, and it's controlled by robber barons, people who want growth at all expense. It doesn't matter. We have to keep building. Every year we set a 10% growth because that's where we are. That's how we think about it. We drive our workers' wages down. It's sort of a race to the bottom of the barrel to see how cheaply we can do things. So that's why a lot of these companies shifted their factories to China and Vietnam and Mexico and other places like that. Do we not need an overhaul, rethinking of capitalism and what has been the model for really the past 30 years? Come right down to it. It's this neoliberal economics that has really just convoluted the whole system, created more income inequality, and has really been detrimental to our society. And we've got to think about, true, growth may be good, but can't you do it within certain boundaries or have ecological safeguards and things like that? Should the business schools not be rethinking this and retraining these people, because they don't think that way today, or at least the ones I deal with?
Well, I hope business schools are to some extent rethinking things along the lines you suggest. But yes, I think your point about the concentration of wealth is a very good one. And that is that it's not really a free market system when you don't have genuine competition anymore. At that point, you have to step in with a significant amount of regulation. Now we're getting off to different topics here, but the point is that that concentration of wealth itself is a barrier to successful adaptation to climate change. Because what are the interests of those that dominate the economic system, and then thereby the political system through their campaign contributions and their influence over the media, ownership of the media even. What are their interests? Do they have an interest in a no growth or a degrowth society? Not much. Do they have an interest in global disarmament, for instance, that might be absolutely required to, first of all, reduce the climate impact of global military, which is huge, but also to set the stage for a more peaceful, more equitable social system than the one we have now? Because one thing that's been a consistent theme in adaptation research is that inequality is a major barrier to successful adaptation. And so how do we deal with that? Can we deal with that in the context of this system that is tending towards monopoly, cartels, and oligopoly all over? It's very hard to see how. That's kind of the problem, is that that may be the only path forward, is either eco-socialism or an eco-socialist ecological civilization. But that's as hard to achieve as emissions reductions, harder perhaps. So if that's adaptation, that's not easy to do, and we may not have time. And that kind of brings me to the other perspective on this, which I identified in the text, which is called deep adaptation. And deep adaptation simply says this is a movement that's kind of emerged in Great Britain and elsewhere. And deep adaptation advocates say, well, this civilization is finished. It is not going to be able to get on a sustainable path. So our real question for adaptation is, how do we prepare ourselves for the world that comes after the collapse of Western civilized or global civilization? And so, folks are out there asking that question. Now, I don't think that the UN is going to recommend anything along those lines, because, as I said, I think it's still kind of in the notion that we can manage this. It's a kind of still a technocratic approach, that we can manage it within existing institutions. And that's going to be put to the test. They may be right. But when we hit 4 degrees, say in the middle of next century, or 5 degrees or more of temperature increase, that may not prove to be true. And the deep adaptation folks may well be proven right. That may be down the road. I probably won't see the outcome, but
I didn't think I'd live long enough to see what's happening right now. But it's happening. It is certainly happening. That's for sure. But this is truly the #1 crisis that we're dealing with. And we have to reevaluate how we're doing business. We have to reevaluate the dirty money, the dark money going into congressional and senatorial campaigns, and a lot of that has to do with how they set up financial incentives, tax laws, and those types of things. And we are way too dependent upon outside money in our political system. But these are issues that we're going to have to deal with quickly, because if the trend continues, who knows what will happen with the glaciers disappearing as fast as they are. We don't know. How's that going to affect the climate on this planet? And by then it's too late. You can't build new glaciers. It just doesn't work that way. But anyway, Dr. Barkdull, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.